Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton agenda Awani secara langsung dari studio Awani Bukit Kewangan Kuala Lumpur. Dan malam ini saya kembali ke salah satu topik yang begitu menjadi pilihan sejak saya mengendalikan sudut pandang dan kemudiannya agenda Awani, diskusi tentang kepelbagaian, diskusi tentang identiti bangsa, diskusi tentang kemajmukan dan bagaimana kita hubungkan itu dengan perpaduan, dan kita pernah sini membezakan di antara perpaduan yang kita idamkan, kesepaduan yang kita sedang jalani dan sebagainya. Dan tentunya orang yang kita bangga pakarnya di dunia ada bersama kita, iaitu Prof. Ulung Datuk Dr. Syamsul Amri Baharudin, yang bukan saja boleh bercakap tentang konteks tempatan tetapi juga konteks dalam hubungan ilmu-ilmu dan kearifan tentang perkara ini dan perkara yang mengelilingi konteks perkara ini dalam dunia antarabangsa. Dan sekarang dalam diskusi saya bersama Profesor Syamsul sebelum ini, beliau juga mahu kita melihat ke arah kearifan yang ada di dunia akademik dan intelek Perancis misalnya dalam hal ini, kerana mungkin mereka memikirkannya dengan lebih strategik sejak berapa lama berbanding dengan kita. Dalam konteks itu, saya ingin meminta izin untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggeris selepas ini, kerana saya juga ada seorang lagi tamu istimewa yang paling dekat dengan saya, tentunya Prof. Ulung Datuk Dr. Syamsul Amri, pengarah Institut Kajian Etnik kita, UKM, dan di sebelah sana adalah pakar yang dibawa oleh Prof. Ulung untuk menganggotai kita juga, Dr. Eric Olmedo, Fellow Penyelidik Kanan kita juga di UKM. Dan dalam konteks itu, I would like to switch to English now. I'd like to welcome Dr. Eric Olmedo for coming. I was just giving this lengthy explanation of how our very own distinguished Professor Syamsul Amri has gone around the world and gotten the best in this subject to come here and work with us in Malaysia. But I guess my first question would have to be on, a lot of people are looking at ethnicity, pluralism, even multiculturalism in a very, very globalized world. In Malaysia, we've been looking at this pre-independent, during independent and post-independent. And distinguished Professor Syamsul Amri has been here many times to speak on that. But I guess if I was to link it to tonight and make it, relevant, why would we have to look at the French sphere in this particular subject matter? Maybe Prof. Ulung nak mulakan dulu.
Let me start by saying that as a Malaysian and I'm brought up in Malaysian scholarship, we are trained mostly in the Anglo-Saxon and British tradition, probably with American influence too. And therefore, when we talk of multi-ethnicity, multiculturalism, we always refer to cases where we are very familiar with. But we forget that when we talk about these issues, we are also addressing the issue of colonialism. And because colonialism is partly responsible in some ways constructing these ethnic groups and creating pluralism. Yeah? So the French has its own history, not only in Africa but also in Southeast Asia, because you remember Southeast Asia is a jewel in the crown where every European power wants to have a say or a part of it, like the Dutch, the British, the French, even the American in the Philippines. So, and because they were colonial powers, there are three things they're interested in. They're interested in cheap raw material, cheap labor, and new market. So because of that, they bring people, they shift people all over the world without thinking of the consequences, because this was for economic demand. So when they left, what do we have? We have this colorful group of people where we call unity in diversity. But it is also at the same time diversity in the positive side perhaps will be celebrated. But diversity also brings fear because of differences, which can cause conflict. And diversity also gives us hope. We know this slogan, One Malaysia. It's a hope. Why? Because we have this diversity. So I think this is what interests us in the Institute, and that is why we are looking at, for the first time, consciously looking at how do the French did this, and we are inviting people professors who have done a lot of work on this subject, and also people who have done a lot of work in Southeast Asia using French sources. So that's basically what we are trying to do at the Institute when we are working together with the French Embassy and scholars from France to have a look at this contribution. Usually it's always British and American, but I think we also have to look at the French after all. We are now a leader of an international force looking for MH370.
Yeah.
So the French plays a very important part. So
before I go French, so to speak, you did relate to me a story of when you had to have a stint in Paris, and how as an anthropologist that really opened up new areas for you to look at.
Well, I think when I was in Paris in 1986 as a postdoctoral student, or rather postdoctoral candidate fellow at the CNRS, I realized that the French has a different tradition in looking at knowledge, delivering knowledge, and also the way they think and theorize. Of course, they have their own prejudices, they have their own shortcomings, but they are just different from the English, the way the English think or the way the American think. And I still feel the American and the British still feel the French has something different. So I think this scholarship is quite continental in nature. Perhaps then I discovered the German also has similar but different approach, have their own approach. And then people in Scandinavia. So suddenly I realized the Anglo-Saxon tradition is not the only tradition. And actually, the Anglo-Saxons quite dependent on many from France for authenticity, for support in the academic world, and the way they translated huge work, Michel Foucault and all of them, they got translated into English 10 years after. And now this is why, in a way, Anglo-Saxon knowledge from the Europe side is always very behind. So the French, the German are always ahead. Because all the big books, French is in French, in German, not in English.
So we're going to unravel some of these big books knowledge, because luckily for us, Dr. Olmedo speaks English. So we'll go to that after this short break. Because of you, I might have to look for French lessons. You are still watching Agenda Awani. We're talking English today because I have a very special guest in the studio, Dr. Olmedo. And if you want to know more, we cannot cover everything tonight, but you have to keep a lookout for this conference happening on the 23rd until the 25th of April. I'll tell you more about it later. I'm going to give time now to Dr. Olmedo to give us your view on why are you here in Kita is one. Secondly, when we look at ethnicity and multiculturalism, for example, we know that nowadays, especially in Europe, this is also being hotly discussed, right from Germany to the French side, back to UK, and then down back to continental in Holland and Belgium even, for example. So this is not just for Malaysia, this is actually for everybody. But what can we learn from the French experience in this?
Okay, so it's true, ethnicity is a very hot topic in Europe, and particularly in France, as you said. France is a bit in a crisis at the present time, because we have been for a long time, as you know, on a universalism model, which dates from the French Revolution, and before that from the Enlightenment period. But now society has changed, French society has changed, and we host, for example, the largest Muslim population in Europe, about 6 million. So the constitution is also in crisis, because the constitution is secular, universalistic, but it doesn't truly reflect the state of society anymore. So, of course, politicians are afraid to go about changing it for obvious reasons. but there are more and more anthropologists and sociologists who are working on the questions, like Professor Amsel that we'll be inviting for the conference. And what we can contribute to answer your question is to propose multiculturalism the French way as a mirror for Southeast Asia, and vice versa, because Prof. Shamsul was telling just now that in Southeast Asia, because of colonialism, some ethnic categories were invented. But of course, France did the same in Africa, for example. But now we have the other way around, is meaning these creations that we made, these ethnic categories, coming back at us in the form of communities in France. And they are replacing the old ways of assessing the difference that we used to have in France, which is the social class, the gender. It was the base for our political model, class struggle and so on. But now there are, we call them minorities, because we don't know how else to call them at the moment, are emerging, and the political and social landscape in France is transforming. And the politicians are doing two things. Some are trying to use it to gain votes, and some they don't know what to do about it. So I think we are at a turning point in France now, and we need anthropologists, we need sociologists, but we also need to learn from Southeast Asia, from plural societies, and we have to find a kind of third way for France. But it will be very interesting, I believe, to compare the two histories and the two models, and to ask ourselves the questions, what is the way ahead?
As I was reading up for this discussion, what struck me the most was too many times the media, the mainstream media, will just speak or talk about or pick up on instances that's just the tip of the iceberg, about wearing the veil or not, or some form of ethnic incidents happening in certain neighborhood or in the public transport vehicle, for example. But as a scholar, I'm sure the hundreds of years of thinking on this have been continuous. From the very first day the French forces have set out to be in colonial areas, for example, Vietnam or even in Africa. So what wisdom has been garnered through all those years, right until now, that is being hotly debated about by scholars, not by populist politicians, but by scholars?
Okay. By scholars is, I don't know if we can talk about wisdom, but the one which is maybe particular to France is to acknowledge the difference, and recognize every individual right to the difference, but as a private matter. His ethnicity is a private and individual matter. His religion is a private affair. Hence, ethnic and religious differences become atomistic, meaning they are narrowed down to individuals, but they are not acknowledged as groups, as communities. Therefore, we don't talk to, we as the French government or authorities, local or national, they don't talk to representatives of these communities, because what is the French thinking at the moment, which is debated, how representative is the representative of this community. So this supposed to be the wisdom you are asking about, is rather to talk to one person who represents a community, but will probably has his own hidden agendas. We erase the existence of category as groups, and we only acknowledge the individuals, and we categorize I would say the social differences, religion, ethnicity, gender, and so on, as private and individual matters.
Okay, I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, I want to get distinguished Professor Shamsul Amri into that discussion, because everything is constructed. If I take the scholarship, anthropological way of looking at this, even what I have inherited as a Malaysian and how I view ethnicity might have, in a large way, been influenced by how it was constructed, maybe even from the colonial times. So, do we have to deconstruct to move forward, or do we have to just adjust and break open new grounds at the same time? What do we do? Because we know whatever the problem is, we need to move on, and we need to reflect the changing dynamics of the present society, not only in Southeast Asia, even in Europe, as we heard from you. That we'll discuss after this short break. The world is very interrelated, and we've gone through the colonial period, but we're not done with it, because there are still things from that period that has shaped the construction and perception of today. And even in the colonial powers' homeland, if we can put it that way themselves, they are looking at issues like ethnicity and pluralism, for example. So I would like to bring in distinguished Professor Shamsul Amri's view on this, because if even the colonial powers, the former colonial powers themselves are grappling with this issue, and they had longer time to think about it. So the deconstruction of certain matters, because we know it's politically constructed, we know it's economically constructed and socially constructed, all the things that we have inherited. But where do we move from here?
I have to explain a little bit this constructionist approach to looking at things. When we talk about constructionism here, we are not thinking of something literal like constructing a house, therefore we can dismantle. I think that's the perception that people has when we talk about constructionism. But in social science, constructionism can be a process of 2 centuries. And like, for example, I give you the notion of Malay, for example. How the census in 1871 in this state settlement, there was no Malay. Malay is only a small category along with Rawa, Korinci, Minangkabau. And then later it was collapsed into one category, Malay. And Chinese was into dialect group, Indian into dialect group and place of origin. So there is a certain efficiency and expediency the colonial powers chose to categorize people into Malay, Chinese, Indian, and others. So what happened was, this construction, or rather this sociological construction, which means that you label people, for purposes of accounting, for purposes of budgeting, for purposes of administration.
Agreed.
Now, as a result of that, people are given labels. And these labels are not necessarily very watertight, but it is useful for administration. But the question is, when this label has a policy attached to it, like for example, Malay reservation enactment, only Malays can own the land. So suddenly the notion of Malay has an economic value. Now, when it has economic value, then there are other consequences, prices, who can buy, who cannot buy, who is this Malay who can be part of that group called Malay. In Kedah, can we include the Siamese as Malay? So all these issues come into the fore, not only between ethnic group, but intra. So this, I mean, there are people talking about deconstruction. Deconstruction is an idea of dealing with this. Deconstruction basically trying to understand the fact that can we just accept this structure, this big structure, without questioning it? So deconstruction for me is an intellectual exercise, never a practical exercise. So in some ways, the dream is to deconstruct. It's also related to private frustration, social collective unhappiness. And that's what you see. You see a lot of grievances as a result of homogenizing people. This is Malay. but there are some Malay more Malay than the other Malay, and then some Tamil-speaking Malay and Chinese-speaking Malay. So suddenly, the notion of Malay is not that homogeneous. So I think this is what we are looking at. What does it mean? It means the boundary of Malayness can be quite blurred in some ways, or Chineseness, or Indianness, or Ibanness, whatever you want to use the category. And with mixed marriage, then it becomes more difficult. How do you deal with this? In Africa, in Latin America, they call them mulattos, mestizos. Here we call them Peranakan. So it used to be Peranakan, only Chinese and indigenous. Now there's Sikh Peranakan, and Indian Peranakan, Eurasian, and then Malay Peranakan. I mean, so it's quite interesting, the life of the concept. So I think here we are dealing with 2 or 3 different things. Number one is an official construction. And this is where the colonialism comes, because when we were independent, these terminologies did not change. These rules did not change, like the way the court, the civil court is. You know, we only change the head. We only change the baju or the shirt.
No more wigs.
No more wigs. But the mind is still the same. So I think this is what we are looking at. And to deconstruct that, it's almost like saying that, oh, I don't like it. But how do you undo that? How do you undo this? So that's why I said...
It's already there.
Deconstruction is an idea entertaining some level of dissatisfaction and negative impact of this construction. So that's what deconstruction does.
But what would you rather look at?
No, for me, at the moment, is that it's even difficult, for example, to change the categories like in Malaysia, Malay, Chinese, Indian. I know there are groups called Sino-Iban, Sino-Kadazan. Where are they? How do we classify them? So this is also an issue which the statistics department wouldn't consider when it comes to census.
So if I have quarter Thai blood and quarter Indian blood, where does that put me?
Then you become Tiger Woods.
So, do you see it the same way, Dr. Almeida, or from the French experience, you can have other unique ways of looking at it?
Okay, yes, I see it. We cannot deny ethnicities today is a social construct, because if you relate it to biological, then you give ground for racism. Now, the problem lies is whether you, how do you want to categorize how do you want to label the people, as Prof. Shamsul say? Do you want to use ethnicity? Do you want to use class, or do you want to use race, as the American does? They have 2 levels. They have the race first, and then the ethnicity. But I think there's no universal rule, in the sense that every classification by any census from any country reflects their own history. The American put first level of race because it reflects also their past with the plantations and the slavery. They have a second level, ethnicities, and when you look at ethnicities, 2/3 of the ethnic groups are Hispano-American groups. So it's just a reflection. In France, if we had to look at ethnicity, we did in the past to construct national history and the myth of the nation. We had 2 original ethnicities, which were the Franks, that gave the name to the country. But ironically, there were German tribes, and they give the names to France. And the other one were the Gauls. But what is interesting is that the Gauls were considered as the people, the peasants, and the Franks were the nobles, the aristocrats. Of course, because they were the conquerors. And but throughout history, we forgot about the ethnicities, but we just looked at the social classes. You're Frank, meaning you're a noble. You're just a Gaul. You're a peasant because you were already dominated by the Romans before. You know.
But that's not good enough anymore. This is all the time I have for today. But if you want to know more, and of course it'll be more strategic, constructed and targeted if you go and look at the KITA's website, and you will know about this conference called Conference on Ethnicity, Asia Pacific and the French Scholarship, happening from the 23rd to the 25th of April. I'll put it on our social media. Anda boleh hantarkan pandangan anda sendiri juga, hantarkan kepada pelbagai platform yang Astro Awani ada, daripada Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, hinggalah ke laman sesawangastrawani.com ataupun aplikasi mudah alih di iOS dan Android. Sekian, selamat malam dan terima kasih. Jumpa lagi. Thank you so much.